Welcome, everyone, to the first conversation in our Emerging Practice Lecture Series for 2025. The Emerging Practice Lecture Series highlights rising Caribbean design practices with distinct methodologies. These practices produce accomplished bodies of work rooted in the praxis of designing in Caribbean contexts, and all that means culturally, materially, economically, and politically. This year, we are exploring what it means to expand the design practice. We are particularly interested in how designers work within Caribbean cultural forms and material realities while responding to modern production systems. So my name is Doreen Duncan. I'm the Executive Director of Island City Lab. I'm joined by my colleague, Jordan Chana, who's the Director of Programs. He's working on the back end of this webinar. We are a think tank that aims to democratize the processes that initiate, build, inform, and maintain towns and cities across the Caribbean. We are super excited to be joined by Marlon Darbeau. Inspired by tradition, by making designs and manufacturing utilitarian objects that challenge what is expected from the Caribbean. Marlon is the founder of byMaking, which is an object design studio. He is practiced in various disciplines, including communication design, identity design, packaging, environmental, and furniture design. He comes from a family tradition of making things in workshops, either at home or very close to his home. His father manufactures sheet metal mailboxes. His great uncle was a welding fabricator, and his grandfather specialized in the making of wooden windows and doors. So super excited to bring on Marlon. Jordan, I'm going to ask you to spotlight him. And as Marlon is presenting everyone, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to start dropping them in the chat. We'll try our best to get towards them at the end. Thank you. Hands over to you, Marlon.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. And thanks to Island Labs for having me and hosting this talk series. So I'm going to just give me a sec. Let me share my screen. Yes. So as Doreen said, so I'm Marlon Darbeau, founder and designer of byMaking. byMaking started, I mean, seeing it now sounds so far away, maybe just over 11 or 12 years ago. It probably could even be 15, almost 15 years now. Basically, it's the only person daily involved in the practice of byMaking, but I will talk about how this practice extends into a larger community and working with different types of practitioners across different skill sets. So I operate out of Trinidad and Tobago. As
Marlon,
you can see.
Do you want to make full screen your presentation?
It actually is.
Make sure you're sharing the PDF. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, full screen.
Let me know if you're getting it at full screen.
We're not, but we're seeing Trinidad, so I think you can continue.
Okay. Are you okay? Let me know. Are you seeing the entire presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I operate out of Trinidad and Tobago. And what I'm interested in, and over time it has continued to evolve, is this idea of how a small nation, a small studio, a small intention aspiration can have a large impact, and also maximizing the idea of small. Because coming from a Caribbean island means that there are going to be obvious limitation to what one has access to in terms of material resources as well as manufacturing capacities. I started off as a graphic designer, which it's the field I'm training. Over the years, I've worked across various spaces in design as a outlined by Doreen. And it's through my graphic design practice that byMaking became a reality. These silhouettes really represent my focus on and love for the creation of graphic forms. So even in the creation of objects, I'm also looking for these strong symbols, almost as if I am attempting to create identities or icons just as I would in my graphic design practice.
Sorry, Marlon,
This
we're
is,
actually, your presentation is not advancing. So try stop sharing and re-sharing.
I apologize for that.
No problem.
Okay, are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we're seeing the backyard.
And am I full screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is my studio, the brown box in the backyard that's attached to the house. Uh, this this is something really sort of special to me because I think it would be probably 15 years ago. Uh, I started to kind of intentionally think about how does one grow their practice, and in my instance, the realities of either renting a studio, building a studio elsewhere. It became very pragmatic, economically, also in terms of timing, family life to build a studio at home. But this also is very much connected to my family tradition of having a workshop at home or very close to home. Just giving you a bit of a peek inside of my space. All I know you can see behind me on the presentation. It's a very small studio, maybe a 9 by 10 room space that obviously opens out into the garden, which allows me to set up. So I want to now kind of turn to this notion of convergence, which has been a central theme for me as I built byMaking. So many years, because I designed it's a very a sign manufacturer, in Trinidad, the sign to see to stand probably singers. I was seeing plastic molding, sheet metal working, seeing furniture being manufactured, seeing the retail side of manufacturing as well. And it did in fact have a significant imprint on me. And sort of combining that with uh, my my formal training as a graphic designer. So as much as I was working in signage, I had a really strong interest in identity design as well as packaging. And this idea of constantly wanting to move things off of the flat surface, off of the two-dimensional surface, and instead, making it something that's playful, colorful, dynamic, attempting to tell a story through objects became something that I was fascinated by. By working in a sign company and where everything that I created had to be manufactured, and that manufacturing was across different spaces, then led to me, even when I entered working in advertising, I just felt this desire to explore ideas around three-dimensional objects. One of the things that have been really important to me is sketchbooks. I have a large stack of sketchbooks where it's a mix of both self-initiated projects as well as commissions or client projects. This sketchbook represents a sort of a turning point or a significant leap in my capacity and interest as well. It says to the edge, a dance between the intentional and intuitive. That notion is something that I came up with when I started thinking about creating a call card for myself to promote myself as a freelance designer. All I was working within an advertising agency, I wanted to get clients. What I didn't know is that this was going to lead to the creation of this little object that then became a large sculpture. So this was supposed to be a call card. It was this very simple idea. Um, this dance between the intentional intuition is this idea of a call card, my left side of the brain, right side of the brain. How do I create a calling card that people would, find very significant and very interesting versus the very simple flat calling card? One day, this fell off the desk in the studio at the agency I was working at, and it began to roll. And while while I was, setting out to create this three-dimensional form, I really wasn't thinking about its kinetic capacity, right? So that then led to me stumbling upon this idea, which eventually became an object called verb. One other thing that sort of converged at that time, and that's why convergence is something that's so significant, is that a friend of mine recommended that I partake in a international design competition for a gallery in New Orleans, and I submitted Verb as a potential project to the jurors, and I was selected. So Verb is this idea of a doing thing. It's about 42 to 44 inches in diameter, significant size object, and it transforms into various things. At this time, this pink and yellow version was made using plywood and then painted very simply by myself and a craftsman that I got assistance with from, and obviously photographed really well so that the judges will, see the best of the object. Many years later, I would continue to explore the idea of verb, both in terms of material, color, and texture. So to the right is a version that I created in 2016, utilizing mahogany and aluminium. The aluminium components were CNC cut, folded at a local manufacturing shop here called Fretworks. Even the mahogany wooden components were also CNC cut on their machines. To the left, while it was also CNC cut, I used plywood because I wanted the sort of the grain, the idea of the texture. So it's this, the two images, same object, same function, but visually they are also doing something else, right? For me, the one to the left, I don't know, takes on a kind of a more hyper sculptural sensibility, and also very much more textural. To the right, a bit more slick, sort of clean and somewhat sterile. So once I had created Verb, this idea of exploring the possibility of object design and pushing the limits into spaces where, while Verb was very sculptural, but there were functional components, opportunities set within the design of the object. I wanted to now explore becoming a bit more intentional around the functional components of the work. So the learnings of creating things that were surprising, projects that began to, at least for me, echo sort of Caribbean sensibilities was very important. But I also felt that while I had begun to have this sense of I don't know, clarity or aspirations for a particular way of working, I still didn't have a concrete foundation on which to begin to really build my practice. And through conversations with persons within my own community, I thought about how do I then think of this idea of convergence? Where does it lead me? And I realized that it would be significant if I could now turn back to my family traditions. This idea of home, material and workshop became a very significant and kind of pivotal component. So my dad manufactures sheet metal mailboxes. He's been doing this all of my life. I'm turning 50 this year, and my dad still manufactures his mailboxes at home. He started off making one box probably per day, per week, sometimes manufacturing them, utilizing his uncle's welding shop for the processes that he did not have the equipment for in his own home space. He utilized my great uncle's workshop. So I saw my dad almost every day making a mailbox from scratch. And soon enough, that business grew into producing hundreds of mailboxes at one point, hundreds of mailboxes a week for distribution and installation across Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere in the Caribbean. So my dad manufactures mailbox. My grandfather produced wooden doors and windows, and my great uncle was a welding fabricator. Both my great uncle and my grandfather's workshops were situated literally next to their homes, large, functioning workshops. I had the pleasure of spending, I don't know if it's pleasure, but I spent many afternoons after primary school at my great uncle's welding shop. Obviously, was unable to really deeply kind of interact with anything because I was too small, dangerous environment. But I did spend a lot of time in their stores, sometimes pretending to be a store clerk with the actual store's attendant, helping sign out tools and other needs of the guys in the shop. I think those things really did have a significant impact, and it also by leaning into it gave me a sort of confidence that I too could one day have a studio or workshop at home producing my own objects. So I was, the idea of entrepreneurship was not something that was unfamiliar to me. It was a part of my family's history. This is my dad's workshop. Very small operation using, very rudimentary, I would say, or old-fashioned tools. Because a lot of tools in his workshop have now advanced, right? So you have a notcher, spot welding setup, brake bender, guillotine. The basic things that allow him to produce his objects. And that idea of the material, the idea of sheet metal, and transforming this into something that's three-dimensional became something that I then wanted to capitalize on in my own experimentation. And what I basically did is kind of looked at my father's mailbox, thought about myself as a graphic designer and my interest in packaging and other forms of communication design is, I spent a lot of time up until this point making prototypes of any packaging projects within the agency or any personal concepts I would have. And I found that there was a very clear kind of line and connection between the capacity of sheet metal folding and paper folding. This then led to me thinking about this, what piece of furniture can I design? I decided to design a small bench. And what I did is I looked at my father's Pira in his workshop. I saw this cardboard box at PriceSmart. I found the construction of the cardboard box really interesting and decided to kind of pursue how do I link, two different worlds into one, right? So kind of merging. And this exploration led to this idea of a sheet metal Pira. And, small benches are very familiar in every culture across the world. The question I asked myself is what or how can I offer a new interpretation of a small bench? And I decided to use sheet metal and the folding techniques that my father utilized to create my first prototype. What I found was that the sheet metal and the gauge I was using, the structural design, meant that the sheet metal and the Pira became very heavy. So because I'd worked in signage and had interactions with CNC cutting and aluminium, I decided to use aluminium because obviously it's a lighter weight. I can have it CNC cut because I am not trained in fabrication. I can rely on computerized methods of producing parts and then taking it into my father's workshop to then assemble, fold and assemble. So it was this sort of unintentional or due to the constraints, merging workshop spaces to then produce an object, which led to the design and production of this object called Pira. And then I added a wooden box, which became, it's a big toolbox component, or it could be the picnic box component conceptually. And again, when I think of the language around verb, this idea of surprise, a doing thing, so that when you see the image on the left, it looks like, a carrying case, a toolbox, but then you realize that it's actually two benches in one, one in aluminium, one in wood. They kind of point to my family history in terms of my grandfather's traditions in woodworking, and then the sheet metal interests of my father, and then my connection to more, at the time, more contemporary or innovations in fabrication. Then I decided to continue to sort of always use something related to my family history, or this idea of the sheet metal as a starting point, leaning in on those capacities, but also pushing my ability to connect with more and more workshops across Trinidad and Tobago. In looking at my father's mailbox, I started asking myself this question around, well, what else can it be? Because with Pira, the Pira wasn't the methodology of manufacturing was the real sort of connection to his workshop. In this instance, what I was pursuing now was a direct sort of reference point visually. Like, how do I then become inspired by a thing from someone who does not see what they do as design, right? My father made mailboxes, I think, for two reasons. He is a skilled craftsman in sheet metal making, but also, I think at the time, it was a way of making extra money to raise his family. So at no point this notion of design would have entered his thinking. And so for me, it was how do I then become inspired? And that's where I started thinking about the two side profiles of the mailboxes and that flange. And, to me, a mailbox in its basic form is a container. And that container could be anything. And then that became what this planter. And this is a prototype that I made in my dad's workshop. Like most of my objects, I always keep one within my own space for testing to see how it functions in real life. And then I continue exploring the object. Again, model making. Then going back to my dad's workshop again with him producing another refined object. And then I had the opportunity of meeting Robert Taniuk of TYE Manufacturing, a large manufacturer of electrical panel boxes and other electrical custom built units. And we then partnered to produce my project Bloom. And this to me was really amazing because while at the sign company, I would have had interactions with more refined technologies. This was now me really getting to sort of play in a kind of a bigger space and to explore how an object can be designed and produced and brought to market, utilizing the technologies that are available here in Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah, because I think that's sometimes always the difficulty. You think up ideas, and then you have to think about what are the ways in which you can make it possible within the context of your own space. Lorraine, if you want to, you can share the video. So that little video, you all are seeing my screen, yeah?
Yeah, we're seeing it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that video sort of shows the process from prototyping to final manufacturing. And with TYE, I was able to fully explore again to me the connection between the kind of a home workshop, small workshop to large manufacturing. So that has kind of become part of my process where I am sort of always prototyping at home at my father's workshop, especially if a project requires more sophisticated ways of producing it. But I usually start off working in my dad's workshop, utilizing his capacities, and then shifting into the bigger space. Uh, that then led to, see in the video, there are three versions of Bloom: staked, trade, and hanging, and fully produced here at home. I'll now kind of go into sort of vocabulary. And when I say vocabulary, for me, it's for me, like in the Caribbean, this idea of language and how we speak. So, when someone says, can you serve me food? They say, can you dish out some food for me? I created these salad servers uh, based on both, the idea of dish out, right? But also, again, exploring material and manufacturing. The spoons, the stainless steel was formed on a hydraulic press at a workshop in Canupia. The fender, again, I'm visually recording things in the environment. Uh, I used to drive a Swift for many, many years, which meant I was like literally always, I felt like, I don't know, like an ant next to trucks. The fenders always stood out, particularly when I was going to Canupia to visit my friend's workshop. And I designed this bench, which TYE then built out an entire series for their staff, their factory workers canteen. Loud bass, the idea of music, pan, again, the way in which language is influencing the objects. So I'm not just only exploring the capacity of material, as in sheet metal or wood, but language as material as well, and that language influences the way in which I think about the object. So when I'm sketching, I'm prototyping, and through the process of making, I may stumble upon a word and then think about how that word can influence what the thing looks like. Mr. Side Table started from a reference point of a gas tank that then led to this midnight rubber, which is why it's called Mr. Midnight Rubber Side Table. And the core of the table is actually a gas tank, which is then turned in timber, and then the metal components. This idea of scene, Trinidadians say, you're making a scene. I had the pleasure of designing these very heavy seats for someone's front garden. And because there's no fence, I just thought, these things kind of need to make a scene. And I named the project Scene. This is based on an old joke my father always told, a very stale dad joke. But the idea of out in informed how I thought about this bench. And again, you can see this continued exploration of folding of sheet metal and its combination with timber. I'm sure everyone remembers pallet sticks. Some places make popsicle sticks. I've been exploring. I've made probably 4 or 5 iterations of display stands based on this starting point of a pallet stick. And then my latest project, basket. I saw this factory roof ventilation fan. And this image became a starting point. And then I asked the question, what else can it be? And then, again, going back to my dad's workshop, I used all the offcuts from his mailboxes and explored the potential of the project, stumbled upon this idea of basket, and then created this project called Basket, which is a lantern. And this idea that, a basket can hold water, which is also a thing that, old say is saying, basket can't hold water. But for me, it can actually carry light. And this is like now one of my latest projects. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marlon. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that was such an professional, interesting and almost organic sort of flow, professional flow, right? And we have a bunch of questions for you. So I'm going to ask you to stop sharing so you and I can have
Sure.
a chit chat. So, I mean, I
Mhm.
think the first thing that's very obvious here is that your work is very, very graphic, even in the way that you present it through those silhouettes. So I'm curious, how does your background in, graphic design, how does that transfer to product design?
Yeah, it does heavily, and I think it's for a number of reasons. So I don't use any um, drawing software that is normally would be normally known, for making of objects or architecture or the built environment. I in fact use Adobe Illustrator, and it's a constraint that has what it basically is me operating like a graphic designer, but my intention is to create something that's three-dimensional. And I'm always more interested in the graphic. In fact, there was a time where I had these sketchbooks where I created a series, kind of exploring what I see around me, and it's called Shape of Things, and that has continued throughout the ideation process of making the work. I am always really fascinated by the graphic, and then that translates into the way in which the objects are treated. Sometimes it seems a little too linear, but yeah,
And then I guess how do you move from the graphics to the conversation about the materials, right? So metal and steel, I guess at least in other parts of the Caribbean, in Jamaica, they don't feel like necessarily very indigenous or organic sort of materials that we have here. But obviously in Trinidad, that's a different case. It is a very common material there. And it's culturally important for whether it's wire bending, carnival costumes, or steel pan. I guess, can you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about materiality, whether it's steel or wood or whatever other materials? How are you, I guess, incorporating those materials within that graphic thinking?
yeah, and I think when it comes to materials, I don't in any way see it, and I am very envious of designers who explore materials to me, sort of very wholesome, kind of big idea way. For me, it was always based on my constraints, right? It was linking the fact that I mean, I can walk into my father's workshop and get sheet metal anytime, right? So that's
Mhm.
accessible. I worked in a sign company. In those days, most letter forms were made out of sheet metal. So I understood just from my sensibilities how it translates from a flat thing that's easily
Mhm.
accessible into something that's beautiful. Um, and because its relationship with paper, there's a way in which, to me, that's materially, weights of paper, thicknesses of paper. It's sort of similar to sheet metal, right? And maybe because I'm interested in these very simple folding techniques as well, to create very strong images, the materials became that's my way of exploring material, and obviously the timber component. And timber, because again, accessible. I think we have some nice timbers here. Um, I and again, it was like linking my grandfather and my father's kind of space as a starting point, and that has sort of continued across all the projects.
Mm-mm. And so it seems like there's like a heritage of steel crafting or sheet metal rather, that's present in your family lineage, but also it seems like there's a sort of 2D to 3D process that is very easy to sort of visualize with that material, which I guess
Yeah,
is related to my next question, which is about kind of the process of prototyping, right? You're manufacturing and prototyping at these different scales, whether it's in your backyard in a studio in a workshop or you're moving into a larger factory. How important is making and doing those prototypes to your process?
yeah. So the name of the studio is byMaking, and it's because I discovered very early on that if I were to be able to produce anything, I would have to start making it, right? I didn't have the luxury of having an idea on a computer and I don't know, emailing it off to some manufacturer. to then send me back a prototype. And I had to kind of get into a way of producing ideas. And it is through that making I sort of understand. And I think I got some advice very early on that basically said the process of prototyping has in it a lot of knowledge embedded. And if I'm not going to commit to prototyping, even from the paper models to very rudimentary materials, use of the materials in my own space to my father's workshop or to other workshops, then I would not really understand what the potential of the end result would be. So a lot of times I have a simple sketch. I may do some what looks like a technical kind of 2D drawing in Illustrator, but then I move straight into model making, starting off at a really kind of small scale, and then sometimes just scaling it up. And more recently, I've gone from kind of one-to-one to from small models to then one-to-one in terms of scale. So I might actually use paper and make a big model, or go straight into material that's similar. I had an interaction with I've been working with a joiner more recently, and I think he was a little frustrated because I keep saying, don't get too bogged down with the details or the finish. I'm more interested in is it gonna function? What are we gonna discover about the way in which it's going to be made, right? And if we think of it as a final project, chances are we will not discover a lot of things, So the prototyping is really kind of important to the process, because to me that's the way the designing happens.
I'm really inspired by that statement of the prototyping is where the knowledge and the understanding comes from. And I'm an urban planner. Island City Lab largely deals with urban planners and architects, so people who are designing things at a massive scale, at a building scale or a city scale, right? And the idea of prototyping also doesn't happen there, right? And so to your point about like testing out these small models, whether that is, a temporary installation of something you're trying to see in the city for a week or 2 weeks or a weekend or something like that. If we're not doing that sort of testing, as you said, you're losing so much information. The interesting findings that you realized.
Yeah. So I've had I have lots of prototypes, paper models that I've either destroyed for reasons of space because I just can't keep them, right? Or because they've failed. Yeah. Basket took me 3 years to get to final, and the reason for that is initially I was not in an attempt to make the project. I wasn't really as informed as I should have been in terms of how it was going to be made. And because I was locked into all the tools available to me at my father's workshop or my own space, it meant that I couldn't produce it. And what would happen is I was trying to by hand form the sheet metal. And it's only over time and I guess stumbling upon a video, I realized I should have basically ordered a rolling machine. And which I eventually did. I bought a rolling machine. And that literally opened up the possibilities of how the project could be produced. Because before that, it would be by hand, and it was almost not scalable or actually functional to produce the object. Because there's a bit about me that I want things to be sort of kind of refined, even if there's a sign of handmade. And so sometimes the tools help make that possible.
And just adding to that point though, like designing so that it can be manufactured and fabricated, but also designing so it can be maintained. I think when you get to architecture and urban planning, that is like a massive thing, right? Thinking about how this thing is going to be maintained. Can you reach around to this back part of this building to paint it? Can you clean off the cobwebs off of it? I think those are design considerations that I think oftentimes they fall by the wayside, right?
Yeah, because almost all of my projects, I am thinking about, and I don't have any big kind of philosophical position on sustainability because I've not investigated or researched in that space. But what I would say is, I am interested in and hoping that what I make can last for a long time, but also considering how can it be maintained. So that
Mm,
I think most of the objects can be dismantled, and it can be repowder coated. The timber could be resurfaced and reassembled. So they're not built like sculptures where it becomes difficult to probably
mm.
maintain when someone. I really want people to own the objects. And to do that, I think I have to think about how they're going to live with them and what's going to happen over time.
Yeah. And when your kids and your dog knock it down, the durability
Yep.
of it as well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I could continue chatting forever, but there's a bunch of questions and comments in the chat. So I have a question here from Roman Knight. What is a design tip or piece of advice that you'd offer to a young designer? And I think similar to that, another question maybe around kind of mid-career, people who are considering pivoting from one design field to another. I guess what are the tips you'd have for early career and a mid-career person who's considering a transition?
Yeah. I think from my own experience, I would say don't be afraid to sort of lean into your own personality, uh, because sometimes I mean, especially now with the internet, right? We have access to so much images, so much design, so much architecture, so much professionalism that we sometimes don't know what's behind the story, like what's really behind that practitioner's capacity or way of seeing the world. And I think that comes from tuning into who you are, uh, what what you have access to, and your own life experiences. Because for me, if I had not paid attention to my own family traditions or even my foundation as a graphic designer, I don't think I'll be able to produce the work I'm producing. All right, so I think finding your own foundation is fundamental to developing your practice, as well as developing a studio practice, which could be, you know, your home. I mean, I used to work next to the washroom for a few years, right, on a little table. So you having a studio practice, I think, is important.
Mm-hmm. I think similar to the question of like understanding your story
And why those stories were developed. I think that's a really good book. And there's another book called Process. I believe it's called Process. I can't remember the exact name right now. Sorry.
we'll get the book recommendations and put them out in a newsletter later on. So I mean, Donnell asked another question about, very curious about how you incorporate language and stories into your designs.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, and that's why I try to wrap up my presentation with the way the words are bigger than the actual work, because I just think leaning into language, as designers, even in working in communication design, we are working with copywriters and strategists every day. And a lot of times, it's actually the words that influence what the images look like. And so I see that similarly in the creation of my objects or in creation of designing objects, where language to me, the written word is very important. And that might be um, making notes once you start designing, like literally attempting to record thoughts, but also tapping into keywords or phrases that may become part of a kind of a jump off point to create other things.
So there are a bunch of comments in here from both Sean and Kevin about where are your products available? Is it only in Trinidad? Can you get them elsewhere? What are the price points we're looking at? You'd have to answer that one, but
Yeah, yes. So far only in Trinidad and Tobago, yeah, yeah.
okay,
And
okay.
via you can message me via Instagram.
Okay, perfect. So there's a comment in here from Renee Kitson. Your Caribbeanness is so dominant in your work. It feels like your designs are for the people, by the people. How do you decide when the final piece is ready? That's a great question. When is it
Well,
ready?
But there's a client involved. Well, it has to be ready when the client says it needs to be, right? But yeah, sometimes it's all most of the projects are self-initiated. So I have the leisure of deciding when. But I would say more recently, particularly when I was working on Bloom, I became a bit more intentional with time. So sort of planning, at least setting some goals around, maybe in 3 months, 6 months, depending on the scale of the project or what the project's function is going to be. I would set time frames for design and production.
Mm-hmm. And so I have a question in here. You talked a lot about your kind of family heritage, growing up in this sort of workshop environment, and just by virtue of being in this family, a kind of a respect of craft and craftsmen, craftspeople. Um, I'm curious if, the sort of respect or understanding craft as like a baseline or a source of inspiration and technical information. Like, I think my long-winded question is like, do you think craft is respected enough in the Caribbean, in Caribbean design spaces?
So,
Respected and preserved.
I mean, from my experience, you know, words like respected or preserved don't come to mind. I think there's an unfortunate reality sometimes, or in many respects, where people are having to make a living. And I mean, I had a conversation a couple of days ago with a craftsman, and he literally said to me, he said, Marlon, you come into the workshop, I'll give you an hour, but there are days where I literally can't give time because your projects may take us, the iterating, the conversations, but I need to pay team members, right?
Mm-hmm.
I need to pay my rent, and I think one of the struggles with a lot of craftspeople, who are in some instances like really good quality uh, 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 manufacturers, you know, they don't have they can't afford somehow to give the time to what their full capacities are. So
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as if the economic reality is what is actually sort of destroying uh, what we should hope is, craft that should be preserved. So it's not intentional, but I think for whatever reason, market forces are not in favor of a lot of craftspeople, at least here in Trinidad and Tobago, uh, unless they're operating at a level where they are engaging with client projects that allow their skill
Mm-hmm.
sets to be really maximized. But to me, in the area of product design and product development, what you would see happening in other parts of the world, that's a very rare thing uh, in the Caribbean because I think the economics so far doesn't necessarily favor it.
Yeah, yeah.
At least that's my interpretation of things.
I mean, it seemed the same way in Jamaica as well. I do remember coming back home and trying to get my bed built by a recommended carpenter. They have like
Mm-hmm.
a pretty large workshop in Kingston. Going there, and he was complaining and saying that people aren't necessarily coming to him to build furniture from scratch. They're coming to refurbish furniture that was bought at Ashley or at Courts or one of these other places, right?
Same
And
story. Mm-hmm.
and the amount of skilled joiners and carpenters, he's had to lay off a lot of them because they're not building anything from scratch anymore.
Yeah,
And unfortunately, literally after my bed got built, the month after they closed down shop, right? So I
yeah,
imagine, as you said, those market forces pushing kind of craft out of, the economy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the story, same story here in Trinidad. It's the dwellings sideboard or the dwellings chair that needs repairs. So yeah, um, but I'm optimistic.
Mm-hmm. And so in I guess last words, any sort of takeaways, or let me not say takeaways, and I don't want to ask you to give advice because I feel like that's a difficult thing to do. But I guess last thoughts about design and making in the Caribbean. We're talking to an audience of lots of students, lots of people who are currently entering the design field, who are excited, who are inspired by your work. Yeah, any words for them?
Um, I think I'd probably repeat some things, but what I would say is uh, to me, maximize the capacity of the internet, right? I do think uh, it serves us really well because we're no longer relying on subscription magazines to know what's happening in the rest of the world, or for the world to know what's happening in the Caribbean. So I think that's one way, like, take the time or make an effort to engage the wider world, even if it's via the internet. Uh, and then even on the ground, uh, you know, I've I've I'm very engaged or spend a lot of time around artists, and that's, to me, it's part of, and architects. I mean, one of my mentors is an architect. I've spent a lot of hours sitting with an architect, talking about my aspirations and about my work. So I think I'm not saying that everyone needs a mentor, but I do think community is important. Having the space and time to have serious conversations about design and architecture or whatever your interests are, and even your own studio practice, I think is important. That time needs to be given, and I also think investing in yourself is important. Um, One of the things that I and it happened all by chance, but when I look back on it, it was really, really significant. Working in advertising for me was not only just about me functioning as a graphic designer, but it gave me some of the financial resources to then spend time investing in my own career. Um, so if I were to look back now, I would say to some people, put a percentage, in the early days, in the early years of your career, if you are working and you do have aspirations to have your own studio, you should be investing a component of your earnings back into yourself. Now that could be getting a desk at home, some tool that's going to make something possible, investigating materials. Otherwise, if you keep waiting, it never happens. There's no ideal reality,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes we look at the wider world and think everyone it's perfect, but it's not. When you speak to designers in international markets, they tell the same story just differently, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And to me, for Caribbean people, Kenya Hara, who I mentioned, says that local is global. So I think we need to kind of lean in on who we are, and I'm in by no means nationalistic in my disposition, right? But I'm just
Mhm.
saying that global is just local amplified.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to sort of lean in on your capacities uh, with a level of confidence. And yeah,
Wonderful, wonderful way to end it. Again, we
yeah.
want to thank Marlon for spending time with us and sharing a bit about his practice and his design thinking. Again, the Emerging Practice series continues. The next one is going to be March 6th. So you can look out for more marketing and information about who those next speakers are. Thanks to everyone who joined, and we really hope we can see you at the next one. Again, Marlon, big ups. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you, Jordan, and everyone who attended. Yeah, really was a pleasure.
Thank you. All right. Bye, folks.
Okay, bye.